All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third Reads event at Sheridan College. Previously, we spoke with Ruby Remenda Swanson, and also we had a great discussion with Brian Francis. So, Pride Reads is a reading series created by me, Dr. Peter Grevstad, from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Sheridan. And in this series, what we do is feature the voices and literary expression of sexually diverse Canadian writers who have published books with queer themes, topics, and discourses. And our intent is to bring queer presence to Sheridan College and to the student and local communities. So Pride Reads will feature Canadian literature and will engage both authors and the community in readings and discussions surrounding LGBTQ plus lived experiences in everyday life in Canada. And to that end, in terms of engagement, we do have a Q&A, and we will have time for that at the end of this recording. And instead of using the chat feature plus a comment feature, we've got the comment box open. So if you have any comments or any questions, put them in the comments, and our colleague Alini will actually let us know when there are questions and we can pose those questions. Before I get to the main event, though, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge the land for sustaining us and for providing us with the necessities of life. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which emphasize the importance of joint stewardship, peace, and respectful relationships. As we reflect on land acknowledgements, let us remember that we are all stewards of the land and of each other. We recognize the land on which we gather has been and still is the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Métis, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. Since time immemorial, numerous Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples have lived and passed through this territory. Sheridan affirms that it is our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here, and those who are yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, and thriving on this land. Chimigwich. I'd like to introduce our author today. I'm absolutely delighted. We are a little tiny literary festival or literary series at a community college, and I thought, after speaking with my friend Janice Zaverbny, who is a local editor, I thought I was asking, who do you know who's doing queer fiction and who do you publish, etc. And then she mentioned Emma Donoghue, and I thought, the Emma Donoghue, that Emma Donoghue. And so I just sent off an email and said, I do this little literary thing, and I'm wondering, Booker nominated and multiple award-winning author, if you'd like to join us. And I'm so pleased that Emma said yes. So I'd like to introduce Emma to you. Emma's from Dublin and born in 1969 and the youngest of 8 children, Catholic, right? Francis and Dennis Donoghue. And your father was a literary critic. I thought that was interesting. Was he a newspaper literary critic or was he a magazine literary critic?
No, kind of literary, New York Times Book Review, that kind of thing. And the kind
Uh,
where once a year a stack of books would turn up in a box with his name on them. And I'd go, oh, that seems normal. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so and you went to Catholic convent schools, lucky you. Apart from, it says one eye-opening year in New York at the age of 10. And in 1990, Emma earned a first-class honors BA in English and French from University College Dublin. Without actually learning to speak French. I was going to test that because I went to a French school here. Um, and then Emma moved to England and in 1997 received a PhD on the concept of friendship between men and women in 18th century English fiction. And that was from University of Cambridge. From the age of 23, Emma has earned her living as a writer and has been lucky enough to never have an honest job. Lucky you, since you were sacked after a single summer as a chambermaid. After years of commuting between England, Ireland, and Canada, In 1998, you settled in London, Ontario, and you live with Dr. Chris Rolston and your children, Finn and Una. And again, please note that there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the session. And if you do have any questions as we go, please pop them in the chat box, which is below. All right. So, Emma, would you do us the extreme honor of reading for us and maybe contextualizing it? And I've got my copy of the book here.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to visit Sheridan virtually, and in particular to go to a Pride book club because the opportunities in sort of mainstream venues to talk about your fiction, they're great, but it means you're always having to kind of raise the queer flag yourself. So it's absolutely lovely to be put in the context of a Pride themed event. So this book, Learned by Heart, is it's a product of an obsession, a long obsession. When I was in my early 20s, I wrote my first play based on the extraordinary secret diaries of Anne Lister, who is she's more of a household name nowadays since the amazing HBO series Gentleman Jack, and she's got this kind of rabid worldwide fan base. But back then, hardly any of us had heard of her. But I wrote a short play based on her decoded diaries from her 20s. And even at the time, I was deeply intrigued by the fact that she talked about visiting poor Eliza. So she used to, every time she was in the city of York in England, she'd pop in to see poor Eliza, who turned out to be Anne Lister's first girlfriend. Anne Lister had many girlfriends. She was a kind of stomping, rampaging butch, and she had enormous success with women. So just about every woman she got involved with would fall prey to her charms, even if they were, married or her girlfriend's sisters. She had a very high hit rate. But her very first love at boarding school in New York was Eliza Raine, who was a biracial orphan heiress. You couldn't make this up. So as the years went by, I was thinking, like, surely somebody's going to write about Eliza Raine, like what a real life heroine, enduring racism and homophobia in Regency Britain. Where's the Eliza Raine movie? Where's the Eliza Raine book? Surely somebody more qualified than me is going to write about her. And they didn't. So eventually I started trying to write a novel about her and Anne Lister myself. And you see, the Anne Lister diaries are from Anne's 20s through to her 40s. So they're a really full source. Say the Gentleman Jack TV show is based on her diaries from her 40s, but we don't have a diary of account of her teenage years. So it's really tantalizing. And that's a situation I absolutely love as a novelist.
Fictionalized.
To take a situation where there are limited facts and they're so stimulating to my imagination and they're so intriguing to readers. Readers, I found, absolutely love the fact parts of my stories, but there's a huge amount of room to make stuff up as well. So I get to wear my historian's hats and then swap them for the novelist hat. I started coming back to Eliza, and luckily a lot more had been found about her since, because the fan base has really got involved in the scholarship on Anne Lister and her whole circle. So I was able to research this novel by doing things like reaching out on Twitter to somebody who said something interesting, and then he or she would decode me a letter from the Anne Lister archives and send it back. A whole group of volunteers among the fan base known as the Lister Sisters agreed to copy out letters for me from the archives in Yorkshire that I couldn't get to during COVID. So it was the most amazing kind of COVID project of bonding with everybody else in the world who had any interest in or knowledge about Eliza Raine, including my own partner, Chris. She's one of the world's experts on Anne Lister. She's published a book, the first collection of essays on Anne Lister with Cambridge University Press. So this was a great kind of mutual obsession during COVID. We'd, work away all morning, and then at lunchtime. Yeah, at lunchtime I'd be like, I found a new tiny factoid, because the basic facts of Eliza's life were not easy to establish. It eventually became clear that she basically was, like many children, the product of colonialism, in that her dad worked for the East India Company, which just ran India, extracted money from India, basically. And he had 2 children with a local woman whose name we do not know. She just turns up in the archives as Dr. Raine's woman, name lost to history. And he sent these two daughters off to England when they were 6 and 8, respectively. So Eliza Raine grew up culturally English, and with this big fortune in the bank, she had about £5,000, which was a big chunk at the time. So she had all those advantages, but she was a brown face in England at a time when, you know, you could get a whole range of reactions. Because I don't know all that much about Eliza's own childhood, I looked at the whole cohort of children of the East India Company, as it were, all the children born to these British men and Indian women. And some of them
were country wives as well.
Exactly, country wives. Yes, we've seen a similar pattern in Canadian history, haven't we? So this mixed race population, some of them, when they came to England, got welcomed into their English or Scottish families, and some were treated like dirt, or, you know, thrown out in the street, or just never acknowledged, never told who their daddies were. So Eliza grew up with this mixture of social status and, you know, oppression, basically, which made her such an intriguing character to me. So I'm gonna read first of all just a little half page. And the frame device of the book is that Eliza, who ended up having a very, very unhappy adult life, she's looking back from a gap of 10 years on her teenage, you know, a year of bliss, basically, when she and Anne Lister met at 14 and fell in love. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the frame, and then I'm going to read the moment that Anne Lister first arrives at the Manor School for Young Ladies, and, you know, stirs them all up. And Eliza Raine is the point of view character for the whole book, because, you know, I was going to divide it between them, but I found as I started writing it that the bits that really thrilled me were Eliza's, because Anne Lister she's been able to have her say in a diary that's one of the longest in the English language, whereas Eliza Raine, you know, has been absolutely silenced and forgotten. So the thought of giving her,
she was erased when she was institutionalized.
Yeah, exactly. She spent decades and decades in asylums, mental institutions. So to me, it was just absolutely crucial to give her back her voice, you know. Okay, you know, so here's a little bit from
Go ahead.
Learned by Heart, which is it's the name of the book. The title of the book comes from the fact that the main pedagogical technique in schools at the time for young ladies was memorize this by tomorrow. You know, huge amount of learning by heart. It was like being an actor self-taping now, you know. So so yes, here's a little bit from Learned by Heart. She's addressing Anne Lister in a series of letters from the asylum. You won't be surprised, Lister, that I so treasure these old haunts of York. It was in that city that I received my education, where I was stamped like warm wax by a seal, formed once and for all. I know you'll recall the song we used to sing, where all the joy and mirth made this town heaven on earth. Well, at the Manor School, I tasted heaven on earth, even as I toiled to pack my poor skull with all the knowledge and wisdom I was told I would need for life. The joke is, Lister, the only lesson I learned, or at least the only lesson I remember now, was you. We two were so young, had barely seen the change of 14 years, as Capulet says of his daughter Juliet. Less than a 12-month the pair of us spent under our slope-slanted ceiling in the attic of the school. But there are fleeting times in life, especially in youth, that shine out more strongly than all the rest and will never fade, like veins of gold in dull rock. For the rest of my life, I believe, I will be transported back in dreams to memory's private theatre, where our girl selves still move, still chat, still laugh. Okay,
Memory's I'm going to jump. Private theatre. I love that expression.
I'm going to jump to the scene where Eliza has been at the school already for quite a while. Being an orphan, she's no other home to go to. And this is the scene where Anne Lister comes to the school as a new girl. Rain is starting to spatter the tall windows now. Giving up on the last tough end of mutton, Eliza hides it in her napkin. Failure to clear the plate earns a mark. She's staring up at the rain lashing the windows when there's a stir at the back of the refectory. A new pupil, it looks like, shedding a huge greatcoat. Not pretty, Eliza decides. Soaked, front hair escaping from a crushed bonnet. Half boots and hem rusty with mud. A shrimp of a thing with neither height nor bosom, but as upright as an officer. We expected you to come in a hack, Miss Lister, Mrs. Tate says very fretfully. The strange girl chuckles. I only walked from the White Swan, not the whole 20 miles over Barnby Moor, though I dare say I could have managed that at a pinch. My brothers and I think nothing of going 10 miles in 3 hours. Her voice is deep and carrying, the accent rather Yorkshire. But the young ladies of the manor school do not stride about town unaccompanied. The newcomer nods as if noting that. And where's your trunk? Mrs. Tate asks. Oh, they're sending it over on a barrow. Miss Lister wipes rain off her spectacles with the dun sleeve of her travelling costume and shoves them back onto the bridge of her nose. She scans the gleaming phalanx of maidens in white caps and frocks. Eliza waits for the moment she'll be spotted, the odd one out. Miss Lister's light blue eyes move on to the end of the row of middle schools and then double back to meet Eliza's, and they narrow as if taking aim at her. Now the head has finished her coffee and is gliding down the middle of the refectory. I bid you welcome, Miss Lister. You've not been at school before? Haven't needed to be, madam. Not since I was 10 and I'm 14 now. The head, Miss Hargrave, blinks, head tilted at this. You haven't needed to be? Oh, I teach myself, says Miss Lister, with a little help from the vicar, for 10 hours a day, not counting the flute. This sets off a susurration of whispers. You teach yourself what exactly? Asks the head. Geometry, Miss Lister throws out, astronomy, heraldry, various modern languages, Latin. Latin, this last raises gasps from the girls. Your efforts do sound creditable, the head concedes, but there's so much more to the moulding of a young lady than... Oh, I know! Has this new girl just cut the head off mid-sentence? Eliza is transfixed. Really, the Lister girl says, I'm here for a quick polish and new connections, of course, so I can move up into the realm I was born to occupy. Titters ripple across the room. The girl quivers like a deer, and then she manages a cocky smile as if she's made the joke instead of being the joke. I'll leave that there, Peter. One thing I love about these events is, the chat bit and the Q&A bit. So that's probably enough to get us going.
More than likely. Thank you for that. Thank you. So congratulations on this recent accomplishment. I really enjoyed Learn by Heart. And how did you first stumble upon this?
It was lashing rain the first time I visited Cambridge, even before I went to study there. So I ducked into a bookshop and I saw one of those, Virago. Virago had very distinctive spines, and they were a women's press. Everything they published was by women. So they had a little juicy apple, as if bitten by Eve in paradise, on the spine. And so I saw this collection of diary excerpts from this woman, Anne Lister, I'd never heard of. And as I opened the book, her voice just seemed to boom out at me. And I had never come across anything like her. And I think, queer people, our history is particularly important to us, because the social myth about us has always been that, like, you're just a phase, you're just faking, you're just putting it on, you won't feel the same way next year, that we're insubstantial and transient and unreal, or maybe just a 21st century bit of kind of decadence. So knowing that people like us have always been around in different ways is hugely helpful. And one interesting aspect of this is that when I write historical fiction about LGBTQ plus people, I'm really aware of trying to give them, a truthful account. I'm not trying to create perfect role models or create characters who sound 21st century, but I am suggesting these are our forefathers and foremothers, And Anne Lister, was such a self-consciously gender-bending person. She never said he. I don't know anyone who was switching pronouns in those days. And she wasn't ever trying to pass as a man, but she was extraordinarily mannish, gentlemanly. She talked a lot about her oddity. She said things like, nature was in a strange freak the day she made me. So she was like an overt gender bender. And so I wanted to write, you'll notice I have the teenage Anne Lister call herself Lister, like the way schoolboys would use a surname, because a lot of trans and non-binary people find in Anne Lister an extraordinary kind of forebear for themselves as well. So I really tried to write this character so that she'd be a sort of fascinating ancestor for trans people as well as for lesbians. And there's enough Anne Lister for all of us.
And was everything decoded before you read it, or was there any extant material that had not been because it was all written in code, right? Like
not all. Interestingly, she used to write her her diary in plain English, but then if she got to anything she was a little bit private about, she would put it in a code that she had devised from I think some Greek letters and some Latin phrases, some numbers. Apparently, as codes go, it's not that hard, but I'm not a decoder myself. So yes, the code had been broken, and a number of Anne Lister's editors had published books of excerpts, but no university presses were stepping in to publish a big edition, as they should. I mean, she's been so neglected. So the fans basically solved it. Partly funded by Sally Wainwright, the amazing showrunner of Gentleman Jack. The libraries, the archive in Yorkshire set up a project where fans would agree to decode and transcribe a page at a time. So we have online, at least versions, unedited, kind of raw versions of every page of Anne Lister's diaries. But what we don't have is all the letters. And I knew that there were about 100 letters in there, either from Anne to Eliza, Eliza to Anne, or about their mutual friend, or no, from their mutual friends about them. But I couldn't get at these letters. And so this little small group of fans agreed to transcribe them for me. So I'd log on every morning and they'd be like, a brand new letter from Eliza,
Oh, wow.
it was like getting, delayed emails from 2 centuries ago. I'm
So these
so
were
grateful.
handwritten letters that had never been formally published?
Yeah, exactly. And even though they weren't in code, I can't read that handwriting, so having people who have a much better eye for manuscript transcribe them for me was just absolutely crucial. So there's no novel I've written out of my 16 novels that I would say I couldn't have written it without these other people, but in this case, Learned by Heart really was absolutely based on the kindness of strangers. Yeah. Though I've met a couple since, when I did some readings in Yorkshire, some of them would come up and say, I'm one of the transcribers, and I'd leap up and hug them.
That's wonderful that it became a job like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I have a burning question that we can address later, but what really struck me, once I realized I went back through it and Eliza was institutionalized, and it seems like she never got out. And I always wanted to know, or since that I've wanted to know, why wasn't she allowed to go home to her mother?
Oh, her mother died. Yeah, quite early on. Their father, Dr.
And he
Rain,
died too.
sent the two girls off to England, very much like off you go and be made English, get your English education. And then he died first, and his will basically says that the mother is to get this Dr. Rain's woman is to get a certain amount of money per month. But then, it says after a year or so, she died too. We don't know a thing about her. And, the trail has run cold. We don't even know, for instance, what religion she was, what language she spoke.
They didn't have birth certificates because there was Eliza and her sister.
They baptized the two girls in the local Anglican church there, but they just baptized them as daughters of Dr. Rain. She just didn't count, this kind of informal marriage.
That's miscegenation.
Just
for the post-colonialists. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So hers is a terribly colonial story. That, even if an individual ends up with a lot of money, they can be so, damaged by the system,
You're still oppressed because you are.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Eliza's letters, she always sounds super stressed. She'll write to, say, Anne's mother and be like, oh, okay, I can't wait to come visit you guys, but, a master is coming to give me a lesson, or, the headmistress wants me to stay on for another term. She always sounds insecure, like she has to be Miss Perfect because, as so many racialized people have said, like, everyone's nice to them as long as everything's going perfectly. But if one thing goes wrong, suddenly the racist sneers come, suddenly the judgments come, and you can't afford to put a foot wrong. So I'd say Eliza was this kind of, alpha student, terribly hardworking, terribly pretty, terribly elegant, very rich, but it didn't save her because people were so quick to judge when something went wrong. And when it did go wrong was basically her relationship with Anne Lister, ended in heartbreak for Eliza, and slowly and painfully dropped her over a number of years. Yeah. And Eliza, had emotional ups and downs, and people were so quick to basically see her as that crazy, foreigner, creature of the East, all these stereotypes about her as a racialized subject in Regency Britain. And then, yes, when she went into a mental hospital herself, wanting help, and she basically never got out. There was nobody there to speak up for her and say, we're going to take you home. She had no home to go to.
What about her sister Jane?
Yeah, she and Jane took very different paths. Jane really embraced the kind of bad girl,
Well, her friend
she
had a
side of
baby
things.
during an assembly at school.
That baby's fictional, but Jane herself, yes, she got married, but then she had an extramarital pregnancy, and she and the husband broke up, and then Jane, later in her Eliza's 20s, Jane keeps kind of crashing in drunk and so on. So she seems to have just embraced the bad girl stereotype just as much as Eliza was desperately trying to be good. And again, Jane died very young. So
Okay.
so they're an absolutely fascinating pair because I think that the whole being children of the East India Company really did mess them up. They couldn't seem to find their footing in England. Jane went back to India with her husband as soon as she could, which I think speaks to the fact that it must have been they must have felt constantly scrutinized by the white gays in Britain. I'm sorry, I don't mean the gay men, obviously.
Right, right,
I mean
right.
the gays are like, oh, you're different. Are you
But
going to be perfect
this was
or
still, yeah, the fetishization of, colonial peoples. And I
yeah.
don't think that either Eliza or Jane would ever have escaped that in Regency England, in the time in
Mhm.
which they lived. But I was curious about that because Jane just seems to disappear. I mean, we come to the end where the girls have snuck off to a fair and they come back and Lister breaks her leg climbing over the wall and then she gets sent home and then that's moving toward the end of the story. But then I was kind of thinking, like, what about Jane Rain? Where did she go?
Yeah, she and Liza didn't get on, and really, took separate paths. And Jane got married and got out of there as soon as she could.
Hmm.
But Eliza, even though there were a few men interested in her, and she had this big fat fortune in the bank, but she never married anyone because she was always hanging around waiting for Anne Lister.
To
So
come
I
back.
don't think it's Anne Lister's fault, like if we leave a girl, we're not responsible for her future. But I have to say it had a bad effect on Eliza's life. But on the other hand, she knew love once. So even though her life is so tragic, I really wanted in this novel to concentrate on the kind of, the glorious moment of it, which was her basically a year at school when she and Lister were secret lovers.
Identity formation, coming of age, and falling in love for the first time. Three very
There's
important
nothing
things.
like it. I remember when I was 14 and fell madly in love with a girl at school. I mean, I put a huge amount of autobiography into this novel. It's funny, if you write a novel set now, everyone assumes it's your life disguised. But if you write a historical novel, they don't. But actually, I put loads of stuff in there.
Right.
I was a very confident, bordering on arrogant teenager. And so like Lister messes up her first day. She makes a joke about all the other girls being ignoramuses, and they're all like, "Who are you?" And that was based on. I skipped a year at high school because my mother was like, "My daughter doesn't need the first year of the high school course," so she stuck me into an upper year. And I joked about other people being ignoramuses, and it took me a long time to make friends after that.
Yeah.
So
Earned some humility.
exactly. So I put lots of my own teenage years into this novel.
Right, right. Well, I thought Jane would have been an absolute scamp, and that scene when they're in assembly and they hear a roar from the back, and Jane's friend stands up, and and then when everyone understands that, oh my goodness, this girl is like heavily pregnant and about to have a baby, and how the women sitting on the dais are just like said they were aghast, and I can just imagine them being ashen faced, because you've got these little. I don't know the little white holly hobbies. It seemed like I know that by year they wore sashes with colors to indicate which year they were in, or if they were early, middle, or upper level student. But they seemed dressed like Holly Hobby dolls, all in white pinafores and hats.
Yeah, all matching white and the compulsory hair. At one point Anne Lister is so sick of having to do like the little ringlets that she realizes she can fake it. She can buy herself this kind of a wig where you just stick it on there and you've got the ringlet. And she's like, sorted.
Right, because she would have
So
had shorter hair.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Um, you're a scholar of English literature and you've got this fancy PhD from Cambridge, but you didn't end up teaching or working
No,
in.
I took a turn just before getting on that highway. I was planning to be an academic because I just assumed I'd have to have, a real job. and then write my novels on the side, as many do. But while I was doing my PhD, I sold 2 novels to Penguin, and it's not like I was suddenly rich, but I was able to pay my rent in the lesbian housing cooperative that I lived in. Luckily, was a very cheap lifestyle to start with. I sometimes meet people who are like, "Oh, I want to be a full-time writer, but I already have 2 kids and a mortgage and stuff," and it's very hard for them to like give up the job. But luckily, I was only a student, living very cheaply, and so I didn't have, a big lifestyle to support. So
Hmm.
yes, instead of going for any jobs, I just decided to write full time, and it's been fabulous. I love it.
Well, yes, and you've given us such wonderful gifts. I mean, in addition, of course, to Learn by Heart, which we're talking about today, is Room, based on well, it was made into a feature film as well, adapted, and was a multiple best-selling work. And that I think really put you on everyone's map when you did that. When you did that. Um, let's talk about book reviews. Do you read book reviews?
I do. I read every one of them. It gives me a great feeling of like control to at least know what they're saying about me, even
Hmm.
though, they're not always good. I remember with one of my novels, it got a brutal review in the New York Times, which is, an important one. And then like at the weekend, it got a brutal review in the weekend edition of the New York Times, a different brutal review. I remember
This
thinking,
same book. This
yeah,
same book.
yeah, but like two, and I just it felt like 2 body blows. So it happens to all of us, but
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
um, I find it useful to see what critics are writing about me. They are an informed point of view. They've read a lot of books, and they can point out sometimes little irritating habits we all have. So I sometimes, if I notice something in 3 reviews, I'm like, okay, that's probably a bad habit. I'll make a note of that. So
Right.
yeah, I find them. It's like the teacher, putting comments on your essay. It tells you more. It's useful information.
Hmm. Except you don't get to do it over again because it's out there and it's published.
True.
Um, Newsday said that we can count on you to plumb the heart of human darkness. Would you go so far as to describe yourself? I mean, that's like a Joseph Conrad metaphor, the heart of darkness, right?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I know what they mean, right? Especially, I think my best-selling books have often been the ones with really meaty, tragic, dark stories in them, like Room, or the other one that's been filmed, adapted Room, and then also The Wonder. And The Wonder is about a little girl trying to starve herself, in the hopes of, like going straight to heaven. So I've got some dark storylines in the books that have sold best, and I have some really feel good ones as well. Like I did 2 books for young readers set in a family of 4 gay and lesbian parents in Toronto, a series called The Lotteries, and that is totally feel good, but of course didn't sell the way something like Room does. So I know what news they mean,
Hmm.
and it's a paradox that I'm, as you can probably tell, an extremely cheerful and happy person, and I write some dark stuff. But
Dark indeed.
fiction needs conflict, and like I've been with Chris for 31 years. I do not tend to write about happy 31-year relationships because it makes a
Not
better
always happy.
story if there's at least conflict. So yeah, I do plumb some darkness, and in particular, I love the way a novel can get the reader to be empathetic to pretty much anyone. So I love
Hmm.
alternating points of view, for instance, so that we see each situation from the point of view of somebody different, and it encourages compassion.
Right. With Room, though, you made an interesting choice. It was simply about the woman who was held captive. I used to live very close to Vienna and spend time there when I was teaching. Um, but I checked out that story further, and that woman who was held prisoner, she actually had 5 children with her father.
Yeah, this is the Fritzl case in Austria. Yeah, he basically locked his daughter up in the basement and kept on impregnating her. It's a horrifying story. So what I decided to do was take just the key point, which was the idea of a child growing up in a locked room. And I thought I'll make it less like the Fritzl case. I'll set it in America, and I'll have it be an above ground shed rather than a basement. I hated the idea of the basement.
Oh,
And I'll make it one child, and he'll have vitamin pills. He's not going to have malnutrition, and his mother is going to be just wonderful. And I'm going to see if I can make it a best case scenario, so I can kind of mull over the extent to which we need freedom as opposed to safety. So I didn't want it to be a story of just, endless miseries.
No.
And so I gave him this kind of ideal, energetic young mother. And the main decision I made in that novel, I suppose, was to have the child be the only point of view. Because again, from Ma's point of view, the mother's point of view, it's deeply sad and frustrating and enraging. But from Jack's point of view, it's just like, here I am with my mom and we play all the time.
And this is where we live.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think, knowing I was queer from my teens, I think it basically has made me very, very interested in how different people see the world differently. And we are all, we're all abnormal in some way, every single person in the world. And so novels can be just wonderful at showing you how other people see things. They shouldn't just be about your experience or relatable. They should be about weird situations where after you read the novel, you're like, I understand that now. I felt like I was there. So I've written about, monks on an island in the 7th century in Haven, situations where you might think like, oh, that's so not me. But if you read the novel, you'll be there. You'll understand them.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that as a kind of a technology of empathy is how I've sometimes described the
Oh, I
novel.
love that expression, a technology of empathy. All right, we have talked a little bit about English racism and miscegenation just a few minutes ago. So I think it's very clear who Eliza Reign was. And I already asked the question about why would he have left his wife behind and taken his children back. But do you think that sort of being without a family, having no connections in the world, feeling quite solitary, do you think that had something to do with Eliza's mental illness?
I do actually. It's funny again. I was saying there's often autobiographical material in historical fiction, but I would say there's often also contemporary material in that I needed to understand what it might have been like to be Eliza Reign and to have everyone look at you and do a double take like, "Oh, you're not white." And she almost never mentioned it in her letters. There's one moment when she says something about, somebody complimenting the beauty of this young lady of color. That's all she says. She never mentions it again. So it's a real kind of loud silence. She was clearly like, let's not talk about it. Like if I keep acting like I'm white, maybe everybody will treat me like I'm white. But it was clearly a factor because once she did get, like emotionally, she had a sort of a breakdown. There are friends in their mutual circle who wrote to each other sort of saying like, I always knew she was terrible. And they used racial language about her then. And so it's as if the racism, seeped up through the crack the minute things went wrong for Eliza. So anyway, I drew on, say, contemporary sources as well. There was a big feature in a Canadian newspaper about the rates of schizophrenia being much higher in racialized communities that are like a minority in their area. So if you live in some, big neighborhood and you're all from a certain place, your rates of schizophrenia are no higher than anywhere else. But people feeling very much like they are the other, they're the marginal, they're different, and it seems to have a terrible effect on their mental health. So I think that's extremely interesting. And we've heard a lot recently say about the many mysterious factors that seem to give Black women often worse outcomes in childbirth, for instance. So I think the effect of that constant stress on say cortisol levels or other mechanisms of your mental and physical health can't be underestimated. So yeah, I can't prove why Eliza and her sister Jane both had mental troubles, but I think the context in which they lived, it would be amazing if it hadn't made them feel isolated and confused
I would think they
shaken.
felt totally adrift because you can't be a 14-year-old girl and say, well, that's it. I'm done here. I'm going to take some of my money and buy passage on a ship and go home and find my mother. You can't do that
Yeah.
when you're 14.
Exactly. There's this tantalizing moment in the Eliza Reign letters where, she's left school. She and Anne have more or less broken up, though Eliza's always hoping. And there's been some, quarrels with friends and so on. But she goes off she goes off and meets a nice couple she knew, another biracial woman from India, and that woman's English husband, and they say to her, come for a holiday to the sea with us. And she's like, no, I have to go back to York, and the stuff to do there. And she goes back to York, and within a couple of weeks, she's in the asylum. She pretty much never gets out. And I'm thinking, go on holiday with the nice interracial couple.
Instead
Yeah.
of going back to your place of oppression.
Exactly. Yes.
Um,
And the pure confidence in Anne Lister's diaries, that's one of the things that many of her readers find so attractive. She thought she was the bee's knees.
well, she also thought she was just as, I mean, she was very feminist. Three brothers. And I want to know, how did she end up with Shibden if she had three siblings?
They died. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because she inherited Shibden Hall. That's what people.
Yeah, from her uncle and aunt, who were not a couple. They were brother and sisters. They may have been queer too. They didn't marry. They shared Shibden Hall, and then they eventually left it to Anne, this very butch niece of theirs. And one reason was that they thought she was unlikely to marry and have the estate go to a husband. So it's almost like they selected her as a queer heir for the Hall.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I found that very fascinating. But also, my other question, it's understandable, although Eliza and her sister, they had they were a great deal of money, let's put it that way. And yet Eliza was relegated to the slope, which was like an attic room that was used to store cleaning equipment, and some of the other servants in the manor house were also housed way up in the attic. Um, so I'm surprised that Jane Rain was not also up in the slope.
Jane, the older sister, was a day girl. She did
Oh.
not sleep at that school. She stayed at their guardian's house. And their father had a doctor colleague, Mr. Dufferin, who took on the girls as a guardian. Not a particularly loving one, but yeah, Jane stayed at his house, whereas Eliza was boarding. And the slope, all we know was that it was out on the attic level, but Eliza, basically, with that kind of watchful attitude I was talking about, the kind of tenseness in her writings, she recorded which girls were in which rooms, and so we can see that she and Anne Lister were in a room together, only two of them, whereas some of the rooms had maybe six. So it could have been a bit of a privilege. We don't know that it was some terrible room, but we do know that by great good luck, probably,
But
they ended up in a room together. So they were secretly lovers. And seemed to get away with it for quite a long stretch of time.
mhm, mhm.
So
But Lister's family had money troubles. Yes, I mean there's a moment in the book where it's clear that Lister's family hadn't paid her fees, and
we're
I'm
not
wondering
quite
if that.
sure who was paying the fees or how. And then Lister was withdrawn from school at some point. We don't know why. There's a lot of just sheer gossip about her that has gathered online that does not have any evidence to it. So it's said that, like, oh, her secret lesbian relationship was discovered and she was expelled. Well, there's no evidence of this. And again, sometimes people have said things like she drove her girlfriend to madness. Again, I would say I've read all the sources, no evidence of that. I mean, she slowly and painfully dumped Eliza, but I wouldn't call that a crime.
But
Just a
were they
tragedy.
thrown together for economic reasons? Because it seemed at some point that Lister's family had trouble financially. Do you think
Yeah,
that's
but
the
I
reason why
wouldn't
they were?
I wouldn't say that made the relationship begin. I mean, Eliza certainly sometimes gave Anne money, Anne often drew on her girlfriends over the course of her life, and finally ended up courting the heiress next door, in quite a marriage of convenience kind of way. She courted her, and they made wills leaving everything to each other and so on. So money was always a factor for Anne Lister, but probably less so at the very start of her life at boarding school. Um,
Right. Okay. And they Claire Clark in The Guardian reviewed this and suggests that scholars, so I guess that's to sort of say I'm not the only one who thinks this. Scholars feel that Eliza is inspired by Bertha, the mad mixed race woman confined to an attic room in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Would you say that that is an interesting comparison?
it's plausible. It's not a very exact parallel in that Bertha in Jane Eyre is a Caribbean heiress, and the
Yes.
idea is that Mr. Rochester was out there and, got married to this local beauty, and her family never told him that she was raving mad already, as to use the terms of the time. So having Eliza be this, rich mixed race Indian heiress in England who didn't marry anybody, very few of those facts link up. But we do know that the Brontes would have been aware of Anne Lister. They were all Yorkshire women, and Anne Lister was talked about. So I think we can see a possible sort of Anne Lister equivalent in Jane Eyre, the idea of a mixed race woman who has been, sort of put away for mental illness. So it's not a very close situation, but yes, it's possible that that's a link to Eliza. But then all the more in Charlotte Bronte's novel Shirley, there's this very mannish woman who owns an estate who marches around, calling the shots. And I would say that looks to me very clearly like an echo of Anne Lister. I don't think the Brontes had met Lister, but they would definitely have heard about her.
Lister was sort of I can, if I need a literary touchstone, I'd say Peer Gynt. Just this character who just, hops from one rock to the next and never gets their feet wet, and is off having adventures and nothing too terrible ever happens. So that's and
I think things happened. Like she got people would put little mocking ads in the newspapers calling her man, sort of thing, or when she had sort of paired up with the heiress next door, Anne Walker, she was extremely conservative. So before the election, like, she wouldn't have had any vote, but she'd have been going around twisting the arm of her male tenants to vote for the Conservatives. By the way, vote, any of you who are living in Ontario and have a vote today? Good. I did too. Use your vote.
In my cast in the snow, I went down a hill to the school. I fell once, but I voted.
Excellent. So yeah, Lister was, trying to make people vote Tory. And so, I believe that she and her partner were burned in effigy. So these were extremely conservative lesbians. So,
yes, exactly. Well, for lesbians, you think they'd support like an anarchist party,
and she probably wouldn't have been in support of votes for women either. She was feminist in her own way. It doesn't always mean that you want to help other people up the ladder.
It's incredible. Moving on, critics have said that the novel is thoroughly researched, and I completely agree. And you've explained your research journey already to us, so that's very clear. But they say that while this minutiae of school life is interesting enough, it doesn't keep the pages turning. What do you think that critics who claim this would rather have read?
Yeah, it's all a matter of what you find interesting, isn't it? I mean, when I've sometimes tried to read novels about baseball, like there's a very famous, what is it, a Don DeLillo one about baseball?
Field of Dreams or something?
Yeah, and I get about 5 pages in and I'm just like, too much baseball. So I suspect some critics feel that about, the dramas of a girls' school. So it's all a matter of what rings your bell. I would say I very much I leaned into the details of school life because I loved the idea that just as, Anne and Eliza, their love happened in the context of this kind of surveilled environment where there were rules for everything.
And demerits and a point system.
That's right. Yeah. Like in boys' schools, they hit them all the time. In girls' schools, they didn't hit them. But there was all this elaborate, like, oh, you're missing 3 marks for French, so you have to do double French tomorrow. And you took 2 slices of bread. Well, you'll get no bread at dinner. They were absolutely micromanaged, like in some prison colony. And the paradox that these were all, girls with enough money to go to a posh boarding school, and yet, had absolutely no freedom and couldn't go for a walk on their
prisoners.
Own. Yeah, so I really liked the idea that I would make the novel itself be enclosed. I love locked rooms, tight spaces, desert islands as situations for fiction. I love kind of shutting the doors and tightening the grip of the circumstances around people to see how they behave,
how they react.
So yeah, I made the novel as school-based as possible. I didn't want to break it up with like, oh, now they'll visit Paris. So I would say either for a given reader, I managed to make the school stuff interesting, or in some cases I didn't. But There's always a moment early on in my writing a novel where I think, ooh, there's a lot about, X subject, like, building a medieval boat, or, how a child would spend their time in a locked room. And I find myself thinking, whoa, I'm going to lose some readers at this point. These readers are putting down the book and walking away. But on the other hand, if I try and get those readers to stay, I will lose other readers. So you just have to say to yourself, okay, those readers are leaving, but the ones who stay are really interested in this stuff. So yeah, I have a habit of just letting the novel be as much like my vision of it as can be. So in this case, containment in a school, and focus on those microaggressions and micro tensions, micro flirtations between all these girls. That was absolutely the book I wanted to write. And for me, a school is such a fascinating little microcosm of the world. And I love all that school stuff. And in particular, I did a lot of them playing games. They had like time to fill in the evening. So I looked up a lot of games, and focused on the ways in which they would, you'd have like the sort of power plays by the mean girls. There'd be devoted friends. There'd be tensions. There'd be bullying. I find that stuff fascinating, and the lives of girls have not typically been seen as substantial, material for fiction, but I think they are.
Do you think that people were looking, I'm just going to come out and ask, were they looking for more of the naughty bits?
Some may have wanted more sex, but I've always found that sex scenes are all the more potent if you don't give the reader too much or too early. So I make you wait. You have to wait for the first kiss. You have to wait for the first sex scene. You're begging for it by the time it arrives.
Now, did
I
anyone
don't like
give
hand it
you,
out.
did anyone oppose this because, or by saying, that these are 14-year-old girls and they're underage and you might not get away with this ethically?
No, because first of all, like, age of consent back then was probably about 10. So it's a totally different situation. But
Okay.
also, this is not a situation of anyone being, groomed or lured into anything by somebody older. This is teenagers exploring absolutely on their own. So no, I didn't get any pushback, or reviewers didn't object either. But it did. Of course, I was publishing this book in the context of, attempts to ban books on LGBTQ subjects in American libraries and so on. So it's funny, like when I began the book, I probably would have thought like, oh, nobody minds this stuff nowadays. It's fine. But actually, by the time I was publishing it in 2023, I thought this book is useful. It's taking part in a movement which is saying, we queers exist. We always have. These are our lives. And that includes 14-year-olds. So I thought it was really, really important to speak honestly and accurately and lovingly about these queer lives in a context where more and more we are being told to shut up and hide away.
And that's Eliza's sexual awakening. So I thought it was rather a beautiful moment in the book because there's so much sexual tension until they just can't stand it and they go after each other like animals.
And they don't have words for it. I
No.
love writing historical fiction on queer subjects because it's a great way to get back before the labels. So instead of being like, oh, I have a crush on my roommate, it's more like, whoa, what am I feeling?
Yes.
And they don't, she doesn't even have words for body parts, so she's having to, like, linguistically, it was a great challenge to work out ways in which she could make sense of what she was feeling.
Especially at such a young age. Um, I love the Lister says on page 103 of the book, history never stops to consult the children. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to remember what's prompted about that, but there are quite a few moments in the book where, these girls are just sort of sent around like packages. One of them, her father dies, and suddenly it's like, okay, so nobody's paying your fees anymore. You have to go home and help mommy. They had just no rights. They were just like, if, for instance, Eliza with her money had tried to just, rent an apartment, or take passage on a ship, she would probably have been refused. She'd have been told, like, girls can't do these things on their own. You need a protector. It would be like, women trying to drive in certain Middle Eastern countries where you're told, like,
Today, yeah.
where's your escort? Yeah. And,
Mm.
we've seen, again, in the States, we've seen ways and moments in which rights that we thought had been extended to all are now being taken away. So, the idea of being not quite a full citizen who has to, live at the beck and call of your guardian figure, it's not impossible. It can
And
happen.
you're transgressing just by being yourself.
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose, yeah, I wanted to make a novel very much about the kind of, disempowered state of children and of girls in particular, and how their lives, mattered. Even in a situation where, in a traditional novel, you might say, oh, nothing's happening. They're just sitting around at school. But if you look closely, there's so much happening.
Oh, there was a lot happening. It was very complex socially, and they both have very interesting emotional worlds. Eliza's much more so because I don't know, I just seemed to feel much more empathy or much more of a connection and experiencing it. That's why I love the novel, but it's experiencing it as Eliza was experiencing it and seeing it through a very young person's eyes. And I thought this was incredible. This was
Thank
incredible.
you. I learned I would interview my teenage daughter about the social dynamics at school, like
Oh,
who said what to who, and the little subtle
and
goings
who's
on.
friends with who this week, and who doesn't like
Exactly.
who, and who's the slut? Yes.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Wow. So history never consults the children, and there's this idea in the book about a well-regulated life. Would this be would this imply whiteness and heterosexuality? And would this be seen as a reason why, for poor Eliza, she goes off the rails?
I think so. It was a society of norms. I mean, nowadays every movie you see, especially for kids, is all about like, follow your dream, you be you. So the idea of individualism and celebration of difference, these are norms to us now, but the norm back then was stick to the statistical norm.
You're with your family, and then you move to a partnership.
Yeah, yeah. It had to be like, legal and church wedding first and then children. And if you weren't the norm in any way, you had completely, stepped off the path. And, they didn't have a welfare state. So if you made some terrible mistake, you'd be literally in the gutter, not metaphorically in the gutter. It was
Hmm.
a brutal society in that way. So yeah, the paradox about girls' schools, though, is that all these girls are being raised to get married and have children and oversee a house. But actually, there they all are, in a sort of hothouse, all girls together environment that, of course, was homoerotic by its very nature. For instance, the windows in King's Manor, which is the beautiful old house that this school, the Manor School, was in, you can visit it, and there's graffiti scratched into the windows, and um,
Mm.
most of those little bits of graffiti are girls saying what girls or what teachers they like or love. It's so remarkable. It's centuries of little scratchings, and they're almost all about crushes. So I think the girls' school as a passionately homoerotic place. It's funny that was being used to try and make these normal married women.
Yeah,
Um,
because the boys' schools were opposite. Boys were brutalized and forced to face
Brutalized, though,
forces
they were pretty homoerotic
and
too.
bullied.
I mean,
Oh yes,
basically,
yes.
single-sex schools as a way for producing heterosexuality. There's a mismatch there.
Yeah, you might not get compulsory heterosexuality at some of these schools. Um, okay, but the well-regulated life, and I wonder, because it made me wonder, did homophobia destroy Eliza's happiness?
Well, it's funny, nobody said that stuff. Like nobody objected to her what looked like her very, 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 very close friendship with Anne Lister. But I think her failure to marry would have made her, she would have been perceived as a failure or eccentric in some way.
Mm.
So I would say, there wasn't enough lesbian visibility for there to be a really conscious homophobia combating it, but there was definitely a feeling of, your duty in life is to secure a good marriage. So if you fail this in any way, either by, stepping outside the bounds of marriage and being adulterous like her sister Jane was, or by failing to marry, that, you're a loser and a weirdo. Yeah.
Or by marrying a woman the way that Lister did. People don't realize this. How did it happen that she was legally married
No, she
in
was not
England?
legally married. No,
No.
she and her partner Anne Walker, they waited till church service was over, and then they just kind of like whispered vows to each other and exchanged rings. So it was a private ceremony, but it wasn't legal.
Okay, okay. Because it was the idea of the modern lesbian, and the creation of that. There's an excerpt. We're just coming to the end. I'm mindful of the time, and I think we have some questions. But you use an excerpt from Shakespeare's As You Like It, in which Rosalind claims, "Love is merely a madness, and I tell you, deserves as well a dark house and a whip as madmen do." Is that sort of like BDSM kind of take on love, or is that like that love is, Pat Benatar, love is a battlefield, right? That you need fighting weapons.
Yeah, I think she's basically saying this love stuff messes with your head so much that really it's like madness, and we've all had moments of feeling like that. And it's interesting in Shakespeare's day, treatment for the mad was very much lock them up and whip them to subdue their crazy behavior. Eliza, although she had like 40 tragic years in a mental hospital, she was not being, whipped or
Abused.
anything. It was a gentler form of care, though it was still, a situation she couldn't seem to escape from. But yeah, I think Shakespeare is mulling over how strange it is that we all want this thing called love, but it can absolutely disrupt your life, and it is
And
a form of
destroy
madness.
destroy your
Yeah,
world.
and in Eliza's case, I think it was very much the relationship and the slow heartbreak of losing Anne to another woman that sort of tipped her over the edge. Yeah, it wasn't immediate. It's not like Anne Lister left her and then Eliza immediately broke down, but you can see the strain in her letters. You can see her, like, oh, nobody loves me. Nobody would care if I died this winter of my bad cough. And at one point she writes to Anne, who seems to be pairing up with this other woman called Tib. She writes to Anne and says, like, maybe all three of us could live in a house. Like, you two would be the main couple, but I would be your loving friend. And I'm thinking, oh, Eliza, have some self-respect,
Yeah,
don't
it might
don't
sound.
do a ménage à trois with this pair.
What is and the idea of children of the earth? Can you explain that for our audience?
Oh, yeah, I wanted
And the
like,
twin self.
yeah, this is it's in Plato. I think he's quoting Aristotle, and basically it's a story suggesting how gays and lesbians might have come to be. So it's this lovely legend where, creatures are formed by the gods who have two pairs of arms, two pairs of legs, two heads. But then at a certain point, the gods split them. So, the ones which were double male became basically gays looking for each other. The ones that were double female became lesbians, and the ones which had been male and female became heterosexuals. But basically, this legend is a really powerful touchstone in queer literature
Hmm.
because it explains not only how, like, you would feel you were just born that way, but also that, love is this undeniable huge existential craving for your other half. This is not some shallow little habit that we can just, repress and not think about. Who you fall in love with is a central fact in your life and is undeniable. So it's been used in other books too, but I thought Anne Lister, being a very, a classical self-educated person, I thought she would have been quite likely to use that one as a way of broaching the subject with Eliza, saying, like,
Hmm.
some
And
of
that and
us
that
are so strongly drawn to someone of the same sex. This is just how it is since time immemorial. There's no fighting it.
how does that intersect with the notion of the twin self?
Well, I would say in English literature, you get an awful lot of literature talking about, either the friend or the beloved of the same sex as your other self, this huge identification between the two of you. But then on the other hand, you can also see between someone like Anne Lister and Eliza Raine, you can see quite a sort of butch femme dynamic as well. So it's interesting that, that gay or lesbian storylines have sometimes used language of like the mirror or the twin or the, like samesies. We're so similar. Here we are in our matching dungarees. But then in other contexts have focused a lot on, the difference that you may be both, called girls, but you may have totally different manners and styles. And Anne Lister really loved being like the gentleman. As I say, she was very consciously gender bending, and she, said, I'm a sort of a female gentleman, that I'm mannish. But then she said also in her diary, like, she was very analytical about herself, and she said, if I had been born a man, I wouldn't get to be hanging out with all these girls and having these opportunities and privacy with them. So she did not want to have been raised male. She liked being in that, all girls together social context of tea parties and visits and sharing beds and inns and so on.
And
She just wanted to be a butch in the hen house, as it were.
And she was very clear about, on the question of marriage, that she said very clearly in the book, that is not in my nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
this is why she's such an extraordinary figure, because, 2 centuries ago, she was saying the kind of stuff that we are still fighting to say now, like, born this way, leave me alone. It's just as good as the other way.
who do you have more empathy for? I mean, some people would think that Lister is some kind of, not monster, but that, manipulative, and abandon Eliza and as rather a villainous figure and very selfish. Do you feel that way?
She's a bit of a rake. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about her. She could be a terrible snob, very, scornful of many of her girlfriends. And she did, she cheated on them sometimes in her 20s. So she's not always likable, but she's an extraordinary diarist, just so interesting.
And a towering intellect.
Absolutely, yes, and just never let the bastards grind her down. But in this book, my whole project was to see how Eliza might have felt, and so you necessarily sympathize more with Eliza. Though again, the great thing about reading all your book reviews is that they cancel each other out. So several reviewers were like, "Oh, Eliza's a bit of a drip. Anne Lister's the exciting one."
Or she's the drag on the relationship, and it's no wonder that Anne Lister walked away.
Yeah, so I love writing a book that people can disagree about. It's a sign that you've done something right, because if you've written it with no subtext, if it's a crystal clear who's the good person in every scene, then people can like it or not, but there's nothing to disagree about. So I love writing something which is more open to interpretation and makes you feel, involved.
And I think, thinking of the characters, I was going to ask which you felt closer to, but then I realized that they're two dramatically different people who ended up together. And I think we like them each in different and separate ways.
Yeah, and I guess I always feel very close to my point of view character, but on the other hand, Eliza is looking at Anne all the time, looking at Anne with the eyes of besotted love. So in a way, she makes us love Anne, So did you say we have some questions from listeners?
Yes. So Alini, if you're still here.
I am, yes.
Hello.
Hi.
So have we got some questions in the chat from people?
We do. We definitely do. We've got some questions and some comments here. I'm just going to go in kind of chronological order. First one is from Michelle. Such a great story. What a wonderful project to delve into. We have another comment here from Lauren that says, for me, a true test of writing is hearing it out loud. Thanks, Emma. Another comment, not a question. I've adored every one of your books and wrapped myself in them. Hearing a portion of one out loud was like being transported right back into the moment I first read it. And that's from Amanda. And then we have our first question here from Ellie. Hi, Emma. It's Ellie Katz here. I played Tib in the Chicago premiere of I Know My Own Heart. What I love about your female characters is how vulnerable they are, but how strong and sassy they are for the time. Do you have any more plays in the works?
Oh, how nice to hear from you, Ellie. Yeah, that was a great production. That production of my Anne Lister play, a recent production, is the first time I ever worked with an intimacy coordinator. And, you hear directors complain about them all the time, like, oh, they're going to tie our hands. Not a bit. I found it amazing. I walked in there not realizing what an intimacy coordinator could add, and then realizing by the end of the session, and that it basically frees actors to go at the love scenes with enthusiasm, because they've worked out in advance what they feel comfortable with. So that was a wonderful production. I am writing other plays. I've got a play on this summer, which is my first musical. It's a folk musical, in that it's for Blythe Festival here in Canada, and it's based on the letters of some Irish sisters who emigrated to Canada during the famine. And there's a very tragic love story in there, and I'm telling the story through traditional Irish songs. Like many emigrants, I was not at all, interested in traditional Irish music when I lived at home, but as soon as I left Ireland, I was like, oh, I hear a ballad on the subway. I'm moved.
God
So,
bless
so
Ireland.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. You know, the play of Room that we did, that had songs in it, newly written modern songs, and I realized that music can just touch people, readers, sorry, an audience in some ways that just words can't. So I absolutely love finding ways to include music in theater these days.
That's a great question.
Yeah. There's a couple more. I might just skip over the comments, just given the time right now. You spoke a little bit about this, about how you came to the idea of this book, but because you write about so many things, how do you decide what you're going to write about next?
It's a good question. I'm you know, sometimes it's like having when you step into the house and like your 5 dogs run up all wanting to be looked after. You know, I'm like, oh, which one needs me most? I always have a number of projects, and I have to say that the project that I'm just beginning to imagine is the most delicious to me because it's perfect. It's like the platonic ideal, the idea of the book, but no actual work yet. So, you know, that's always the most desirable. And then there's if you're in the early months of writing about something, again, it's all fresh and delicious, and you can like choose which bits to write. You can suddenly say, oh, I have a great idea for the ending. I'll do that now. But then there's a bit in the middle of each book where I'm a bit like, oh, why did I choose to set a novel in a girls' school or on an island or in a locked room? I'm stuck. You know, then there are bits that I need to get done, but I don't feel like writing them. And sometimes, to be honest, I cheat on one book with another. You know, I get a bit bored and stuck, you know, doing this full time. And I would just let myself go off and write a few days on a future project. So that kind of, you know, deliberate infidelity can really help, because then I go back to the first book, you know, refreshed by the absence kind of thing. So one thing I do is I write myself kind of Stalinist, you know, 5-year career plans. You know, I'll be like, okay, you know, what do I hope to get done this year? What do I hope to get done in the next 5 years? Big picture. Do I want to be working mostly in this genre or another genre? So I'll write myself little bits of advice like, you know, if you're doing that novel and this play this year, then you can't take on another film project yet, or you can't be doing book reviews as well. You know, so I try and kind of be my own manager, as well as be the writer who's like, you know, hungrily rushing after each new idea.
That's a great answer, Eileen.
And I don't ask my publishers, by the way, because I don't think they I don't want to be limited by what they think is going to sell. You know, so I write my books before I
You don't
tell
tell
my
them that,
publishers at all.
yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll be able to let you
Oh,
go on.
there's Marisol who has written lots about my work. Hi. Okay. She says, I'm your Spanish follower. I have a question about Eliza's apparent madness.
Go ahead.
It's difficult for me to believe in it, since I think female madness was an invention of patriarchy to regulate and control women's behavior. That's a really good question. I thought about it a lot because, of course, we don't have like medical notes. What I can say is that this is not one of these situations where other people said Eliza was mad and dragged her off screaming to the asylum. I would say she herself mulled over her own feelings and was disturbed by her own feelings. And she went and asked a doctor to sort of, you know, have her come stay in his small private women's asylum short term. So I'm not saying that she was handing over her life for the next 4 decades and saying, lock me up, not at all. But I would say that the original impulse to name it as you know, a breakdown or madness came from Eliza. Now, you might say, Marisol, that she had, you know, absorbed the patriarchy's ideas about how a woman should behave. That's very possible. Certainly, I would say one of the main sort of symptoms she was feeling was anger, right? She was angry with Anne Lister. She was angry with friends of theirs. She was angry with her own guardian, for instance. She was angry with her sister. So I think perhaps a young male heir in Eliza's position would just have like stomped around the estate and shot a few deer. And he wouldn't have been so quick to say, I seem to be losing my mind. So yes, what was acceptable female behavior was, you know, within a narrower range than male behavior.
And
So,
women were seen
you
as
know,
innately hysterical.
Maybe I don't know. Eliza seems to have hoped that she'd get out soon. Like she writes from the asylum. Her last letter, it's so poignant. She writes from the asylum, kind of going like, "Oh, feeling so much better, and I'm sorry for how I've behaved recently. Sorry about all my craziness, but I hope I'll be better soon." And then another 40 years go by, so it just breaks my heart.
Aline, have we got one more question or comment that we can do before we wrap?
Yep, there's one more comment here. I'll dare to ask the nonfiction question in a fiction-focused session. You've borrowed loads from your life, as you say. Would a memoir be something you'd consider in the future?
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I never would, unless something really new and interesting happens to me. Never say never. But my life so far has been so consistently happy and extremely stable. I kind of model myself on, I think it was Flaubert, who said, I live a life of quiet bourgeois respectability so that I can write wildly. So I would say I put all my wild stuff into the fiction. My domestic life has been so happy. There's not that much to say. So I wouldn't personally read a memoir about a life like mine. But as I say, if new and, strange or dark things happen, then maybe, but not with my life so far.
What are you doing? Okay, someone wants to say hello.
Hi.
This is Pablo Neruda. He's my Jack Russell terrorist. He's just saying.
Um, our orange cat Siobhan never wants to take part in Zoom events, so you'll just have to take my
He's
word for
been
it that she
patiently
exists.
sitting across the room, and I
Mhm.
think he senses that we were wrapping up, so he gave himself a shake and came over to say hello. So all right, well, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I mean, it was, this thing where I thought Janice Zervebny said, you could try to get Emma Donoghue, and I thought, "Tr- okay, I could try, but I really didn't think that you were going to talk with someone from a very tiny college literary festival, but we're so pleased you did."
Well, your tiny college has a big profile, especially in theater. Nobody in Canadian theater could be unaware of Sheridan's outstanding BFA in musical theater, for
Musical
instance.
theater, creative writing and publishing, we do as well.
Animation. So you guys, you hit above your weight. If no, I should never try and use sports metaphors. I almost get them wrong. Punch above your weight. Anyway, you guys
Something
are a
like
big
that.
deal. And you've brought in,
Hush.
listeners from all around the world. I've just seen Helen Sandler from Wales, who edited a book I had a story in. This is a wonderful kind of reunion.
That's great. All right. Well, I think this is a good place to stop because the dog's starting to bark at the door. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time. What's interesting, I think I told you about this, was the first book of yours that I read was Slammerkin. And I found it and I was really thinking about it. And I think I found it if you've ever been to Bangkok. I used to teach near Bangkok, so we'd spend weekends there. And in the backpacker district, they have all these pancake places and but they always had a lot of used bookstores, and that's I discovered the first of your works in a used bookstore on Khao San Road in the 90s.
How wonderfully random. I'm so glad.
And as I told you, it was the book Slammerkin, and I knew nothing about you. I'd not heard about you, but I was, living away, and then I thought, I don't even know what a slammerkin is. And so, just on a whim, I picked up the book and said, well, I'm taking this with me. I don't care what it's about. It's got a really cool name. So,
Well, what a delight for me to have a job where I can like send out my little seeds across the world, and who knows where they're going to wash up.
yeah, that's exactly right. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure and a delight. And stay warm. It's awful weather here, and it's sleety and slushy and icy. So stay warm, and I look forward to whatever's coming next.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for taking part.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you.